Hey everybody, Nathan Brown here with FCP Euro, and today we're here to talk about the two different transmission options available on the first generation Porsche Cayenne. We're going to discuss some of the specifics in terms of some of the problems you may have, the best services, and how to fix some of the problems that do pop up. So sit tight and we'll get right into it. So the first generation Porsche Cayenne was sold from 2003 until 2010, and that covers both the 955 and the 957 generations. These two generations, although they did have different engine options and a lot of different variables there's really only two transmissions that are available and only one primary driveline. The most common is going to be the automatic ASIN TR60SN 09D, usually just called the 09D, or a manual. The automatic transmission was introduced in 2003 and the manual was introduced in 2004 on the base model Cayenne. So the 09D transmission is the same unit that was also used in the first generation Audi Q7 and Volkswagen Touareg. So there are a lot of options out there if you ever needed to do a full transmission replacement or something like that. And generally speaking, it's a fairly reliable transmission. It does require, just periodic service. But other than that, just some ancillary items will generally go bad. Now, speaking of service, that's going to be your most important thing on this. And most of the problems that you encounter on the ASIN 6-speed automatic are going to be related to a lack of service. Porsche specifies a 160,000 mile or 16-year service interval, and that's quite frankly way, way, way too long. You'd be much better off shortening that significantly to something around 60,000 miles to get the best performance and best reliability. And what happens is that if a transmission's not serviced, dirt and debris and particles build up in that fluid, and they'll begin to wear the transmission valve body, and that will begin to give you problems with how the car shifts, up or down gears, how it accelerates, and things like that. If the transmission has never been serviced and you're way, way deep into that mileage range, servicing it can also potentially cause some problems by breaking free the varnish and again, clogging or damaging the transmission valve body. So keeping up on your fluid and filter changes is extraordinarily important on the automatic Cayenne. Now, it is worth noting that on the 955 generation, there was a DME update available from Porsche to rectify some hard shifting problems that plagued the earlier cars. If that hasn't been done, definitely get that done at a Porsche dealer. But if it has been done, it may be time to start looking at something a little bit deeper. Now, the transmission valve body is available in a remanufactured or as a new unit, and it is a little bit expensive. But it is not too terribly difficult of a replacement to do, although you should be aware that some of those may require coating depending upon the unit that you get. So another potential problem on the automatic Cayenne is actually not a problem that's due to the transmission itself, but due to one of the problems you may be aware of if you watched our engine video. Essentially, the coolant pipes, when they fail on the first generation Porsche Cayenne, as that coolant makes its way to the back of the engine, it can actually get into the bell housing area and begin to build up around the torque converter shaft. There's essentially a seal there on the torque converter, and that seal can begin to be damaged by the built-up coolant because it does get quite hard. It's almost like little rocks in a way. So if you do think you have a torque converter seal that's torn or leaking, you're going to generally notice some fluid, transmission fluid on the bell housing and gathering underneath of that and possibly on the ground of underneath of the vehicle where it gets parked, depending on how bad that is. Now, it is important to note that although the transmissions are the same, there are two different torque converter seals depending on the engine that's in the car, so be sure to check your VIN to make sure that you order the right one if you're tackling that job. So that pretty much covers all of the main problems that you encounter on the automatic transmission that are going to be able to be serviced or diagnosed by yourself at home. From there, we move over to the manual transmission option. Now, the manual is fairly rare, but they are certainly available. And they're available on both the base model Cayennes with the V6 engine starting in 2004, and then the GTS V8 starting in 2008. And again, both of those going up until 2010. So the manual transmission in the Porsche Cayenne is pretty reliable. There's not really a lot to discuss other than your normal wear and tear items, and that's mainly related around the clutch and the flywheel. Now, the flywheel itself is a dual mass flywheel, and the only real fault that you'll get with those is that as the miles pile on and as the flywheel begins to wear, it may go out of balance internally, since there are two main components to that. If it does go out of balance or you begin to have a flywheel failure, you'll generally notice a vibration. It can be anywhere from light to fairly heavy depending on how bad the flywheel is, but you will notice it will vary with your engine RPM speed. Whenever you're replacing the flywheel, obviously you want to replace the clutch as well. And I would typically recommend replacing the clutch slave cylinder. The clutch slave cylinder is a hydraulic component that physically actuates on the release bearing to disengage the clutch. If the clutch slave cylinder fails, you're generally going to get either an internal or an external leak. If it's an internal leak, your clutch pedal will go to the floor. You won't get any feel out of it. You won't be able to change your gears or disengage. And if it's an external leak, you'll generally be able to see some fluid there. And again, you'll still probably have problems getting it into gear. As a rule of thumb, if you are having trouble with a manual transmission Cayenne and it is applicable for every gear in the transmission, so like it's hard to get into first, second, third, fourth, hard to get into reverse, that's probably related to the clutch or some other system more than an internal transmission problem. If it's one gear in particular, or it's one set of gears, so if it's like just fourth gear, or it's just 2, 4, 6, that's probably related to something internal in the transmission. That's just a little tip in terms of your general diagnostics if you're having trouble getting it into gear or having trouble shifting or something like that. So the manual transmission Cayenne has the same exact service interval as the automatic, 160,000 miles or every 16 years. Now, normally on a manual, I'd say you could push the service on that a bit more than you could on the automatic, but the actual amount of fluid in the Cayenne transmission is under 2 liters, which is not a whole lot. And given the weight that it has to push around, given the fact that you can tow with the Cayenne, I would again recommend a 60,000 mile fluid service interval change on the manual transmission fluid. Again, as with anything, we recommend local moly lubricants on any of these. So whenever you're doing your manual transmission service or automatic transmission service at 60,000 miles, it's not a bad idea just to get it out of the way and also do your transfer case service. The transfer case service basically uses a standard automatic transmission fluid similar to the automatic, and it's a fairly simple process. So the best rule of thumb is if you do all your fluids at 60,000 miles, everything is fresh and you know that you're getting the best performance and minimizing the wear and tear on those components. So now that we've gone over the 2 different primary transmission options available on the first generation Porsche Cayenne, let's go ahead and jump into some of the more generic, general components that are covered on all models, regardless of which transmission they use. First and foremost, you're probably going to see problems with the cardan shaft bearing. Essentially, the cardan shaft is what Porsche people call the drive shaft, and the bearing that supports it right here has this rubber piece that's bonded around the support bracket. The rubber will degrade over time, it will crack and it will break, and that will allow play to develop in this drive shaft. Once that fails, it is quite noisy. It'll sound like absolute hell probably, and you could probably limp the car home, but you don't really want to drive the car very far if that were to happen. Now initially, the only way to repair that would be to replace the entire drive shaft. And if your drive shaft is showing some other wear, if the CV axle end or the CV joint end there is starting to have some play in it, you may want to just go ahead and replace the whole unit so that you know that it's all good. However, one of the other common problems that you will see on this has to do with this drive shaft flex disc right here. These are often called a gibo as well. So if the gibo fails, it will generally show up as tears in the rubber. Similar to the cardan shaft bearing failure, it will usually show up as some kind of a noise if it gets really, really bad. There is a kit available from Miley that includes the new drive shaft flex disc and a new cardan shaft bearing. So you can potentially replace those units without having to do the entire drive shaft. So the last component of the Porsche Cayenne driveline that we're going to talk about is the transfer case actuator motor, sometimes called the stepper motor. Now this piece right here actually mounts into the transfer case / Porsche traction management 4-wheel drive unit, and it's responsible for changing from high range to low range 4-wheel drive. What typically happens on this is that it will begin to seize due to not being used fairly regularly, because most people with Cayennes don't necessarily use their low-range 4-wheel drive. So one solution to potentially avoid from having a problem with the actuator motor is to put it into 4 low range periodically, once a month or something like that. If you do that, drive 10 feet down the driveway, put it back into higher range, go on your merry way to work, and you should be good to go. If this does fail, like I said, you may get some fault codes or fault messages on your instrument cluster. You may also notice some driving issues, including lurching under acceleration, some clunking, or some vibration under acceleration. The only real solution is to replace it, but as I said, it's fairly easy to access and pretty easy to take care of. So it is worth noting that there is an updated version of this actuator motor that is available from Porsche. So if you have an earlier 955 model and it has not been updated, you may find some value in doing this switch, even if you're not currently experiencing any problems with your Cayenne's transfer case. So that about wraps it up for most of the common problems that you're going to encounter on either the automatic or manual transmission Cayenne, as well as the various driveline components that they both share. If you have any questions, please add them in the comments below. Likewise, if you own one of these vehicles and have some of your own experiences to share, please do so. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and of course subscribe to the channel if you have not already done so. And with that, we will see you on the next one.